In the days leading up to Pearl Harbor, the atmosphere wasn't calm, but it also wasn't panicked. It was something far more dangerous. Uncertain. Washington knew war was coming. Intelligence officers had been intercepting Japanese communications, decoding fragments that hinted at a break in relations and imminent action. But those warnings arrived as pieces of a puzzle, not a clear picture. They spoke in cautious language, wrapped in diplomatic phrasing and military codes that demanded interpretation. And interpretation, especially under pressure, is where everything began to unravel. One message in particular would later stand out. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was dangerously understated. It contained a code word meant to signal that negotiations with Japan had failed and that hostile action was likely. To those who sent it, the meaning felt obvious. To those who received it at Pearl Harbor, it was filtered through assumptions that had already taken root. The prevailing belief wasn't that a massive air assault was coming, but that if trouble did arise, it would look like sabotage from within, or perhaps an attack somewhere far from Hawaii. Pearl Harbor itself was seen as too distant, too well defended, and too obvious a target to be struck first. That belief shaped everything. When the code word arrived, it didn't trigger alarms blaring across the base or emergency orders to disperse ships. Instead, it was treated as one more serious but manageable warning among many. Commanders acknowledged it, filed it into the broader context of rising tensions, and carried on with Sunday routines. Battleships remained moored close together, neatly arranged along Battleship Row. Not because officers were careless, but because doctrine and habit said this was normal. Aircraft were parked wingtip to wingtip on airfields, not ready for rapid takeoff. Because the greater fear was sabotage, not enemy planes dropping bombs from the sky. This is the quiet tragedy of the code word. It didn't fail because it was wrong. It failed because it was vague, and vagueness invites assumptions. No one explicitly said, an air attack on Pearl Harbor is imminent. Instead, the message relied on shared understanding, on the idea that everyone would connect the same dots in the same way. But they didn't. Human beings rarely do, especially when those dots challenge deeply held beliefs. The idea that Japan would launch a surprise carrier-based air attack across thousands of miles of ocean felt almost unthinkable. It was bold, risky, and unprecedented. So the mind naturally reached for safer explanations. As a result, readiness remained partial. Ammunition was secured rather than distributed. Anti-aircraft guns were not fully manned. Crews were present, but relaxed, many enjoying what they thought would be a quiet Sunday morning. Even as intelligence grew darker, the routines of peace lingered. The code word that should have cut through that normalcy instead blended into it. It became a warning without teeth, a signal without urgency. What makes this moment so haunting is how ordinary it was. There was no dramatic argument in a command room. No officer slamming a desk and shouting that disaster was coming. There was paperwork, polite acknowledgments, and an assumption that there would still be time to react if things truly escalated. That assumption would prove fatal. In warfare, time is everything. And Pearl Harbor lost it not in a single instant, but gradually, through misinterpretation and delay. The battleships anchored in the harbor embodied that lost time. Massive, powerful, and symbolic, they were designed to dominate open seas, not to sit stationary under aerial assault. Their positioning reflected confidence in existing defenses and faith in established thinking. When the code word failed to shatter that confidence, it quietly sealed their vulnerability. By the time anyone realized what the message should have meant, Japanese aircraft were already in the air. Engines humming, pilots descending toward a harbor frozen in the wrong posture for war. Looking back, it's tempting to frame this as incompetence or negligence. But that oversimplifies a far more human story. The unseen mistake wasn't ignoring the warning. It was misunderstanding it. It was assuming the future would resemble the past, that any attack would follow familiar patterns. The code word was a key, but it was inserted into the wrong lock. Instead of opening the door to full readiness, it reinforced existing beliefs, lulling commanders into thinking they still had breathing room. This is why that single coded message matters so much. It shows how intelligence alone is never enough. Information must be clear, specific, and matched to the mindset of those receiving it. Otherwise, even the most critical warning can pass through unnoticed, stripped of its urgency by routine and expectation. At Pearl Harbor, the code word didn't scream danger. It whispered it. And in the calm before the attack, that whisper was drowned out by the comfortable noise of normal life, leaving the battleships exposed and history poised to change forever. When the first explosions ripped through Pearl Harbor, the earlier misunderstandings instantly transformed into irreversible consequences. The harbor didn't wake up to a sudden realization of danger so much as it was violently forced into it. The attack exposed, in the harshest possible way, how every small decision made before that morning now stacked against the defenders. What had seemed like minor delays or reasonable assumptions suddenly revealed themselves as links in a chain that could no longer be broken. One of the most painful examples was how information continued to falter even as the attack unfolded. Radar operators on the northern edge of Oahu had actually detected a large formation of aircraft approaching the island. They reported it, doing exactly what they had been trained to do. But the report traveled through a command structure already conditioned to expect something else. The response was casual reassurance that the contacts were likely friendly aircraft, perhaps American planes returning from the mainland. In a cruel twist, the radar had worked perfectly. It was the interpretation that failed again. Echoing the same mindset that had dulled the impact of the earlier code word. As bombs fell and torpedoes tore into hulls, the battleships became prisons of steel. Crews scrambled through smoke-filled corridors, desperately trying to reach locked ammunition lockers and unmanned guns. Anti-aircraft defenses came alive slowly, unevenly, as sailors ran to stations that should have been ready long before. The ships were massive and powerful, but they were also rigid, designed for set-piece battles rather than sudden chaos. Every second lost to confusion magnified the damage. And those seconds had been quietly stolen in the hours and days before by flawed procedures and misplaced confidence. Communication between different branches of defense was another invisible fracture line. Naval Command, air defense units, and intelligence teams each held pieces of the situation. But no one had been positioned to assemble the whole picture quickly. Orders and reports crossed paths or stalled entirely as officers tried to understand what was happening while it was already happening. In that fog, decisive action became nearly impossible. The system wasn't built for speed under surprise. It was built for deliberation, and deliberation was a luxury the defenders no longer had. The doomed battleship at the heart of this story stood as a stark example of how those systemic failures converge. Torpedoes struck along its side, exploiting the fact that the ship was moored in shallow water and unable to maneuver. Fires erupted, and as the list increased, escape routes disappeared. Sailors fought bravely, improvising repairs, tending to the wounded, and manning guns wherever they could. But courage couldn't compensate for preparation that had never fully materialized. The ship's fate was sealed not by a lack of will, but by the cumulative weight of decisions made long before the first Japanese pilot began his descent. What's important to understand is that no single person caused this outcome. The destruction was the product of a culture that trusted established doctrine too deeply and questioned it too rarely. Battleships were still viewed as the centerpiece of naval power, and the idea that air power could neutralize them so completely had not yet fully sunk in. Procedures reflected that belief, emphasizing protection against internal threats and traditional naval engagements. When reality diverged from those expectations, the system struggled to adapt in real time. As the attack ended and the smoke began to clear, The scale of the failure became impossible to ignore. Ships burned or lay capsized. Aircraft were wrecked on the ground, and hundreds of lives had been lost in a matter of hours. In the aftermath, investigations would dissect every message, every report, and every decision, trying to understand how such devastation could occur with so much warning in the air. Again and again, they returned to the same conclusion. It wasn't the absence of information that doomed Pearl Harbor, but the way that information had been processed, shared, and acted upon. The earlier code word fit perfectly into this broader pattern. It wasn't an isolated mistake. It was a symptom. The same assumptions that softened its impact also shaped how radar reports were dismissed, how defenses were relaxed, and how readiness was postponed. By the time the truth became undeniable, the opportunity to change the outcome had vanished. The battleship's destruction became a physical monument to that lost chance. A reminder that modern warfare punishes hesitation as severely as ignorance. This is why Pearl Harbor continues to resonate beyond its historical moment. It demonstrates how complex systems can fail not through dramatic blunders, but through ordinary, reasonable decisions that align in the worst possible way. Each step made sense on its own. Together, they created a vulnerability that an enemy was quick to exploit. The unseen mistakes were not hidden because they were secret, but because they were embedded in routine, habit, and confidence. In the end, the lesson is unsettling but essential. Power, preparation, and intelligence mean little if they are filtered through assumptions that no longer match reality. The battleship that went down that morning did not fall because its sailors were unprepared to fight. It fell because the system around them had not fully accepted the kind of war that was about to arrive. And when that realization finally came, it arrived with the sound of explosions, leaving no time to change course and no way to undo the cost.